if something leads to our own destruction and our own collapse, it means there's an anti-human aspect to it. And it's definitely related to the end of the World War II consensus. It's all about freeing ourselves from stricture, right? And the individual, like the idea that your self-realization is more important than you perpetuating the human race. I mean, think about it when I say it that way. Like your self-realization, what I mean by self-realization is not like some high spiritual thing. It's not like you dedicate your life to God as a monk or something. What I mean by your self-realization is like your career or your, you being able to buy a boat or to like be able to retire at 45, like something like that. Like that's more important than the continuation of the human species, which is crazy that anybody could ever think that. And though it's been completely normal to think that now since the 60s. This is Jonathan Pajot. Welcome to the Symbolic World.
Hello there. Well, this is Martin Shaw, and I'm afraid whatever you had planned for January, scrap it. I am returning to Symbolic World gleefully with one of the great stories of our time, the Epic of Parzival, the story of the Holy Grail itself. Over 5 nights, I will be telling the tale. These will not be dry lectures or PowerPoint presentations. These will be wild, old, philosophical storytelling in its deepest dimensions. It is life-changing stuff, this story. I've written a book about it. I've been studying it for 20 years. I've told it all over the world, but I have not shared it with you. I've not shared it with Symbolic World. So what else would you want to do in the great wintering time but to sit at the feet of this wonderful story and let me be your guide? I'll see you there.
Hello, everyone. I am here with Jean-Philippe Marceau. I think most of you that have watched my channel for years know about Jean-Philippe. Jean-Philippe is actually the author of our very, very first theory book at the Symbolic World. It's called, you got it also, it's called Post-Reductionist Christianity, A Way Out of the Meaning Crisis. It has been called by people that I trust very much the mere Christianity for the 21st century. It's a lean book. It's not very thick. It's very efficiently written, and it gives you a line through the argumentation, at the end of reductionism and kind of how to think about this new mode of reenchantment. But today, that's not what we're going to talk about. Jean-Philippe wrote this article on demography, which surprised everyone. And, all these people were writing me, people that I did not expect were writing me messages, saying it was such a great article. And so we thought, because it's kind of in the air right now, like the whole question of demography, it says something that it seems like we could never talk about before. And all of a sudden everybody's talking about it. And so we thought we'd do a podcast on it. And so Jean-Philippe, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, it's as you see, it's in the air. I feel like one aspect of this, especially that we couldn't talk about, was the genetic aspects. I think with good reason. Like after World War II, we decided to not think about this, but it's coming back. And the first time I heard about this, I was very surprised. I must give credit to Louise Perry. That's the first person I heard say this. She mentioned, she was on Chris Williamson's podcast, that progressivism as an ideology also incarnated in people is self-limiting because its adherents don't reproduce enough. Yeah. And the thing I hadn't realized before was that the propensity for political and religious inclination is partly genetic, like not that genetic, but around 40% of the variance is explained by genetics. It means that because progressivism doesn't lead to people having enough kids, they get outbred essentially by more conservative people. And because the math of reproduction is exponential, what seems to be happening is, okay, right now there's a replacement happening of conservative people taking over culture more and more, even at the genetic layer. And it means that, okay, while the population is shrinking right now, as soon as a country industrializes, it seems, its birth rates start to plummet. The only exception right now seems to be Israel, that has both, but like every other culture, it seems that when they industrialize, their demographics collapse. But we might see at some point like a rocket upwards, because if then the people who are left are the people who are resistant to the demographic collapse that we're currently undergoing, then the population might just explode. So this made me very interested, because it seems like it's a very strong pattern moving through history right now, and I had no immediate way to connect it to the Bible. And like I always, like, if there's a powerful explanation of something, I always try to see, okay, like, what's the analog in the Bible? Because in theory, I think all the patterns should be there. Like at their core, every pattern should be somewhere around the incarnation. So I talked about this with you privately in like the conversations that we have offline, and the only thing we could come up with was the flood. And okay, so there's like this parallel that Noah was righteous in his generation, while there's depravity around him, is the seed that is left to repopulate the world afterwards. And like, it's not just his ideas, it's also like his seed, his genes that are gonna then repopulate the earth. And okay, so there's definitely this that's happening. One thing then that we also noticed was, like, could we find surrounding ideas that also match the demographic collapse that's going on? And the thing that we can see pretty easily is why the flood happened. It's not detailed that much in Genesis itself. It says it talks about the Nephilim and depravity going on in the earth, but it doesn't provide that many detail. It's essentially a reference to the Book of Enoch. And then, like, if you read that, you can see, okay, it's a mix of technological and sexual sins. Like there are demons, the Watchers, who give forbidden knowledge to humanity, knowledge that they're not ready for yet. And also the Nephilim will, and the Watchers will reproduce with human women to create weird hybrids, the Nephilim. And that sounds very fantastical for people who aren't like aware of symbolism. But if we try to explain what's going on right now to a population that doesn't know about like Facebook and Pornhub and like all of our technological system, it's hard to see how else we could put things. Like, we have technology that allows stuff like contraception and women doing pornography online, and then spreading that to like thousands or tens of thousands of men at the same time and stealing their seeds at the same time. Like, you have a kind of weird hybrid there. Like, there's this technologically enabled pattern that lands in women and creates these hybrids, and then it does stuff like steal the seeds of men. So
I mean, we're literally going to have sex robots like pretty soon. So how would you explain sex robots to, let's say, a culture that has lost all of that technology? Let's say, I mean, it would be very difficult to explain it, except to talk about some kind of mechanized demon, or, so, you know, like, it would be very difficult to explain it without using the type of language that you find like in the Book of Enoch surrounding those traditions.
And so, okay, so but that's interesting, and you can make other parallels, but like basically the kinds of sins that you see in the Book of Enoch, you can see parallels with what we're doing in culture right now. And you've made videos related to this too. Like, if people have watched your videos on whether the witches have won, like, it's the same kind of ideas. You have these weird hybrids that we've created in part through technology. Okay, so it seems like we're starting to have an interesting pattern now that's matching between Genesis and our current demographic collapse. Honestly, if I only had these ideas, I don't think I would have written an article, though, because it's very one-sided. It's like, okay, sexual revolution, bad. And then the progressives are gonna vanish, and only like the conservative religious folks are left, and there we go, we won. So that would have been too one-sided as an article. But like, digging more into biology, because it's not just that, but in general, biology seems to be the place where there's lots of like interesting ideas to mine these days, especially for symbolism. But digging more into this, I ended up learning that it's not just religious people or conservative people who reproduce more than progressives. Like, more specifically, one thing that's worrisome is it turns out that people who have authoritarian leanings and xenophobic leanings also like have pretty high birth rates. And in fact, like, those tendencies correlate more closely with high birth rates than religiousness. So it means that, like, for the let's say the people who want to be like faithful Noah, okay, like they're gonna make it through the flood, but then it's not like it's paradise on the other side and everything is rosy. Like there will be something like Babel and the collapse of Babel coming afterwards. Like,
yeah, and I think that really, I mean, for people to kind of understand it symbolically, it's such a powerful insight, because when you look at the story, it's so confusing, right? Because you're like, okay, well, here's this breakdown, and then here's this fall. It leads to the flood, leads to chaos, leads to Noah making it through the fall, and then immediately after, you again have this weird thing that goes on. And what you realize is that in some ways you could understand with what's happening now, what you're describing, you could understand why the fact of reducing the seed, and to in some ways eliminating all of the elements that would lead to more looser behavior, you could say, or more experimentation and more exploration type of behavior that leads to hybridity and confusion and chaos, and also to to degeneracy, that you would end up with something like a tendency towards tyranny.
Yeah. It's one way that I tend to put it is like the sexual revolution tries to detach sexuality from its procreative purpose and just lets people try to enjoy the pleasure without the purpose. And the people who accept this detachment, rather the people who can resist this detachment are the people who have some kind of attachment to a tradition that binds them to life, like that will attach like sexuality to its purposes. And people can be attached for good and bad reasons to their tradition. So like someone can be faithful like Noah, but someone could also just be stubborn and be like just super conservative and not think too much, and like those people will make it through the flood too. So I think it's good to keep in mind, okay, so on the one side, like the runaway progressivism that seems to like have peaked somewhere in the like early 2020s is gonna die down. But what we must start to pay attention to is like overcorrection to conservatism, to something that's too rigid, like Babel.
Yeah, that's probably why such a variety of people reached out to us to, relating to the articles, that they could see that we weren't just saying, like you said, hooray, this whole progressive thing, it's like self-defeating. It's gonna basically swallow itself. And so, it's for sure there's no winning on that side. But that in that reduction, what you end up having is a propensity towards tyranny. It's interesting because it makes you realize how, in some ways, I think Jordan Peterson talked about this quite a bit, which is the idea that in some ways religious strictures and social strictures, what they do is that they actually limit the excesses. And so by, in some ways, basically enforcing monogamy, through social strictures, in some ways what we've done is we would have kept these more exploratory aspects of sexuality and would have remained in the margin. Like they would have still be there. The types of behaviors that have led to the sexual revolution were still there, and they're still around. And then the reasons for people mating and the reason for people moving in a certain direction wouldn't be those characteristics, right? It would be all kinds of other characteristics. But now what happens with the sexual revolution is that profligate type sexual revolution, people end up matching with each other. People that are very progressive end up coupling and end up moving in that direction, and then conservative people kind of find each other and move and then come together. And so what you end up having is exactly this surprise, which is in some ways you might be weeding out those characteristics from the genetic pool over a few generations, because the people that have that tendency, they find each other and they don't reproduce. It's wild. It's like when you start thinking that way, like it makes you realize just how the world has a form, and if you just pull, if you pull things in one direction, it just naturally swings because of how it works.
Yeah, it's surprising that, let's say, it's becoming so clear now, and I hadn't really heard people talk about this like just a year ago. And I also think there are probably historical precedents for this. I've heard some people make the argument. It's hard to know for sure, like what happened, how Rome converted, but that one of the big reasons might have been precisely this, like almost
demography.
exactly the same pattern that we're having right now, because the ancient Romans were very degenerate sexually, to a point where the male Romans didn't want to have kids. Like they were such a rigorous, extreme hardline bunch that they didn't want to have to deal with children, so they would have the kinds of sexual relations that don't yield to children, or they would just expose the babies to let them die. So like you're not gonna have a culture for very long if like all of your elites do this, and the Christians did like
the opposite.
Yeah, did the opposite. So like and you can do the math, and it's possible that a very large amount of the conversion of Rome was due to exactly this pattern. And it's the same thing as the flood. Basically, you had like this previous world that's like a mix of technology and sexual degeneracy that dissolves, and the only seed that's left for the next world or the people who accept Christianity, and they then take over exponentially during a few centuries.
Yeah, and so, I mean, and it's fascinating too, like you said, in some ways, it's weird how narrative functioned and how, I mean, I'm sure you had noticed it for a very long time. Like these are things that I've been thinking about for a long. There are a lot of things that I think about that I don't talk about because I also want things to land. There's some things that aren't worth saying because there's no fertile ground for them. But it feels like in the last 1 year, like really 1 year, things have radically changed. We were Jean-Philippe and I were talking about this is very niche for us, but just last week, a famous French-Canadian kind of polemicist, Mathieu Bocoté, was on like the most popular TV show here in Quebec, and talked about demography and talked about the idea of basically immigration and demography, and how with French Canadians not having children and people from the outside coming and having children, like you're going to vanish. And their like left-leaning respondents were just hushed to silence, which would never have happened like just 2 years ago. They were just completely they couldn't answer, and it was wild to watch it. And we've seen similar things in the U.S. as well. These kind of discussions. So it's so I think that in this time, it's definitely worth for us to take the time to how can I say this, to bring in some wisdom and to show that yes, this is true, and it's important to see it. And it's important to see how degeneracy leads to lack of children and basically the end of people. But that the reaction is positive, but it also has a dark side, in the coming behind it, you could say.
Yeah. I think there's also this moment that it's easier now to talk about higher level patterns like demons, and I even think there's like, again, this historical parallel, because I was listening to Dr. Michael Eiser's book on the Watchers, on Enoch, Reversing Ermine. That's the title of the book, and he mentions that people seeing the incarnation as the reversal of what the Watchers did. This used to be a very common interpretation for the first 3-4 centuries in Christianity, and then it pretty much vanished. Like people started to focus on the fall of the Watchers, and people started to focus instead on the fall of Adam and Eve. And I think it's related to what we said with Rome again. Like there were these higher level patterns of degeneracy in Rome that were vanquished by the incarnation, and then people didn't need to talk about them as much. And then it became more relevant to talk about the sin of Adam and Eve and how not to like commit that again ourselves. It's one way maybe to put it is let me know what you think, but one way to put it is that because Jesus succeeded in reversing what happened on Mount Hermon with the Watchers, then he sort of put us back in the garden, like he transformed Rome into Eden, or in the vision that you have of the heavenly Jerusalem. Obviously, it's not perfect, but like typologically, that's what happened.
Some iteration of it. Yeah.
And then when you're there, then the sin that you must focus on is not repeating what Adam and Eve did. But now that Christianity has collapsed so much, we're definitely not in the garden anymore. I feel like we're more in the Rome situation, and now like people can talk about the higher level patterns that are controlling us, and it's much more obvious now than it would have been 300 years ago, let's say.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. And what's interesting is also in some ways to see the blindness, because anybody who was attentive would have noticed that these types of patterns would lead to the breakdown of people. Like, when the pride culture was becoming ubiquitous, and let's say at the sexual revolution, we should have seen it. But then, especially when pride culture was becoming kind of more popular, people should have started to notice that it's like that you need certain things for there to be more people. And as we actually watched, and we would say, if you remember, I remember even when I was in high school, they would say it. They would say, "Oh, the birth rate is such so, and it's below replacement rate." But it was as if there were these weird blinders that even though we keep saying that, we don't realize what, first of all, led us there, and then what that means down, just 2 generations down the line. And so, and to realize that if something leads to our own destruction and our own collapse, it means there's an anti-human aspect to it. But it is wild to see how no one was able to notice that until basically, I mean, there's some people, I know there are some voices that have been screaming it for a while. But let's say all of a sudden it's become more accessible to public discourse, now for just a year. And it's definitely related to the end of the World War II consensus. Because the World War II consensus is in some ways all about, especially in the West, it's all about the freeing ourselves from stricture, right? And the individual versus the collective and all of these types of things. And so this idea of self-realization, like the idea that your self-realization is more important than you perpetuating the human race. I mean, think about it when I say it that way. Like your self-realization, what I mean by self-realization is not like some high spiritual thing. It's not like you dedicate your life to God as a monk or something. But what I mean by your self-realization is like your career, or your, you being able to buy a boat, or to be able to retire at 45, like something like that. Like that's more important than the continuation of the human species, which is crazy that anybody could ever think that. And though it's been completely normal to think that now since the 60s.
I think also that it's people have a hard time imagining the negative aspects of population collapse. There's some we can go over, but I also think, just to circle back to the World War II consensus is not talking about heredity. I also think that's a huge aspect. It became totally off the table to talk about heredity, with good reason. But I think one of the reasons why the article hit home for people is that it's easy to picture, if you just do the math quickly, because it's in many countries, like in the US and Canada, if you look at the people who go to church at least once a week, they have a birth rate that's above replacement or around replacement, and it's stable. If you look at the people who don't attend church, it's quite low. It's similar to Japan, let's say. So if you just do the math on that, you can see pretty quickly what's gonna happen, and then people can picture this. Okay, and it's even more intense if you consider more conservative religious groups like the Amish or Hasidic Jews, or even people around you, who go to church and you have 4 or 6 kids. If someone has, let's say, 5 kids, and their kids have 5 kids, and so on, they're gonna have they're gonna have over 100 great grandchildren. But if you do the same math for people who have who are secular progressives, and a couple has 1 kid, you have 2 parents for 1 child, you need 4 grandparents to have 1 grandchild. You need exponentially, they're gonna if you do the math for just a few generations,
Collapses.
Yeah, it's really a quick collapse. And then you can imagine this, if you're a progressive and you imagine yourself all of a sudden, rather than being 50 of you with 50 conservatives, all of a sudden it's 1 of you with 99 conservatives. That's easy to imagine, and I think it hits home. There's a real problem there.
Yeah. It is definitely wild. And in some ways, I think that for now, since the 60s, because there was this World War II narrative that was strong on us, then in some ways the progressive thought that it wasn't a conscious thing, but let's say it ended up that the progressive taking over the education system they thought that they could win, because by taking over the education system, then they could perpetuate themselves through initiation rather than perpetuate themselves through transmission, right? I mean, through like having children. So the way to perpetuate yourself is mimetic. So you're doing this like transfer of information. But then that can last a little while, but it still will collapse, because I mean, at some point you just have less people, and then the mass of you can maybe influence some of them to become progressive, and it's going to work for a while, but it's a losing game if you try to look at it over a few generations.
Yeah. Also, yeah, I want to talk more about that, and also it circles back to just demographic collapse and why, like, it's hard to imagine what will happen. I used to think that, okay, there's just going to be fewer people, and I don't know, it's going to be easier to buy houses, I guess. Like, I didn't used to see it so negatively, but again, there's researching this, I found some people to make good arguments that it's like really a huge problem, because our socioeconomic systems expect exponential growth, and we've based our systems on those expectations for a long time now. So, for instance, you need something like 3 people working full-time to pay for one person's pension, like one elderly person's pension, and like we're not at that ratio.
No,
We're not hitting that ratio.
definitely going to it will bring about some kind of civil unrest, not very far in the future. I was talking to some people in France. It's already really heavy. I mean, the weight is very heavy on people there, and so I know that will, and that is definitely one of the reasons why here in Canada they've been pushing MAID. They've been pushing medical assisted dying, because they know what's coming, and so yeah, it's all pretty terrifying.
Yeah, and even like in the private sector, so you can look at, because it's happening already in some cities. Like, they're not able to, let's say, pay the pensions of, let's say, the police force enough, and then they can't hire like more policemen, because then they can't even pay for the pensions of the older, like, retirees. So you have less people in your town. You have less policemen in your town, so like there's more crime, so people don't want to go there. So like the property values, like, they all go down, so there's fewer taxes, so it just spirals. And like in those situations, the people who are able to leave, like at the scale of a city or a country, like if a country starts to have this imbalance where there's too many old people and they're like trying to extract everything they can from the younger people for their pensions and for the public infrastructure and so on, like the young people who are able to leave, they'll just leave. So like you just perpetuate, like you just accelerate the problem. And like many countries seem to have gotten into this place where I don't think they're really gonna get out. And it even harkens back to
robots. That's the solution.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. Elon has been pushing hard for like that. He's based. I mean, I think he sees what we're seeing, and he's saying the only way forward is robots, because there's no other way.
Yeah, maybe like Babel again. I'm super skeptical. Like, it's,
I know. Well, that's
hard
right.
to make robots.
That's a right way to think about it. Is that the some of the interesting things about the recent robots, like there's this new robot where it seems to function, but it's actually someone in India with like a headset that is like controlling your robot in your house. My goodness. So I guess that could give us like a little bit of a little longer, but I don't see it. Doesn't we need people?
Yeah, I'm skeptical. One thing that also, to go back to one of your previous points that also parallels what we said earlier, is like it's quite likely that as like governments start to collapse due to lack of funding, due to shrinking populations, like it's hard to imagine any country that can get out of this without some kind of dictatorship or like monarchical system, because like pensions are super popular. Like people don't, especially if you have a population of more elderly people, they're unlikely to vote against pensions. So like in a democracy, like typically you won't fix the problem. So it's quite likely that at some point, like it seems like the only way that a country can get out of this kind of stuff is like someone just imposing, okay, like we're gonna get rid of all this like public spending and we're gonna start something else. So again, like Babel kind of system that just unifies everything.
Yeah, and you can see. I mean, I think there's Millet, and then there's also Trump, who's kind of trying to do that, but he's not really succeeding. Doge was a desire to kind of do that, kind of make that kind of gesture, but doesn't seem like it's succeeding, because he wants to be popular more than he wants to cut spending, and so he still has a massive deficit budget. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. But I mean, I think that, though, the one thing that we can still say, even though there's danger in it, is that what all of this does demonstrate is that those who get married, have children, who raise families, like, they really are the only future. There is no other future. All other futures they're stunted. They're selfish, and they lead to degeneracy, and they fizzle out. And even though we have to be attentive to the problem of tyranny, which is definitely real, there still is no other way forward.
Yeah, and I think, again, doing the math and thinking about heredity there, at least makes me quite hopeful, because let's say if you told most people that, okay, like, if they're a good Christian, they're going to influence like 100 people throughout their lifetime, I think most people would be pretty happy. Like, if like 100 people, let's say, converted through, like, in part through your actions, I think most people would be pretty happy. But like, if you just have good families for a few generations, you're gonna have that kind of impact, especially because, like, the rest of the culture dissolves so much. Like, so I don't know, again, you can do the math a little. Like, let's say you have 3 kids, your kids have 3 kids, and then they again have 3 kids. You can have something like 27 great grandchildren. Grandchildren. No, great grandchildren. And like, if you contrast this with, like, if the rest of the culture, let's say, add like a fertility rate at replacement, they would have, like, on average, I think it would be 16 great grandchildren. And okay, so you wouldn't like necessarily think too much that you're having a disproportional impact. But if the the birth rate is around 1, like, the rest of the population is really gonna have, like, probably, like, less than 1 or just 1 great grandchild. So, like, you have a massive, like, impact on the world just by, like,
having children,
being faithful, like, in your generations, like Noah, being righteous in your generation. So
yeah. And the thing is that's important, and this is going to be the most controversial thing we'll say, but the thing that's important is to understand is that there are people that totally understand this, and that in some Islamic circles, this is a clear strategy. It's like where we will just outbreed them, and it just means that we'll outbreed them, and then within a few generations, then they'll be gone. They'll be gone, not necessarily eliminated, but they'll be gone in the sense that their influence will have diminished and will be irrelevant. And so, unless we're kind of aware of these realities, like, we can't be in the illusion. But I think the illusion is bursting, because look, there's a Muslim mayor of New York now. There's a Muslim mayor of London. And so this is something that is going to happen more and more. So it's good to be aware of it.
Yeah, it's also important to talk about technology there. I tried to go through this in a balanced way in the article, but, like, there's this real challenge of how do you maintain, let's say, the fruits of civilization. How do you maintain, like, the good aspects of technology without also collapsing fertility rates? Because that's really the challenge right now. You mentioning Muslims makes me think about this, because right now Muslims have a huge issue that if they're in, like, they come from poor countries, they have high birth rates, they go to the West and their birth rates collapses faster than Christians. Yeah. So, like, the only group that seems to have managed so far are Jews and, like, some kinds of conservative Christians, but they're not as easy to identify. But if you look at so Israel, for instance, has a fertility rate of, like, 3, which is very impressive for an industrialized country. And even if you look at Jews in let's say big cities in the West, they have, like, they're typically around replacement or a little bit above, which isn't the case for, like, if you take just Christians, let's say, typically they're not going to be there. But I think probably if you could, like, select specific groups of Christians, probably you'd be able to get something like this. But still, like, there's the overall challenge of how do you maintain the good aspects of technology without the civilizational collapse. And I think there are good things to do with technology. So I tried to do that in the article. I realized so far that in this discussion we've been really negative about technology, but that's something that's becoming clearer as well now. We have stories now of people during the last few years who have converted in large part through social media, YouTube, podcasts, and so on. And sometimes it's really like helping reinvigorate churches that have real troubles. I've heard a lot of this in France, for instance, where the culture is collapsing so much around young people that they get interested in alternatives. Like typically people will start looking online now and they'll find good content online by, let's say, Christian or especially Catholic content creators in France, and they'll consume that kind of content for about a year. And afterwards they're ready to go at like their local church, and often it's not that great. Like so like if that was their only exposure to Christianity, they might just like stop right there. But because they've seen so much good stuff online, then they're willing to
make the effort, because their parish church might be a complete catastrophe.
Yeah, exactly. I've heard this fairly often.
All these old priests that are still in the old mentality, like they're still in charge. So it's like it probably is exactly what you're saying. They come in and they're like, oh. But they're probably prepared for that online too, because people talk about it. You know, people talk about how, you know, the church is real, but that there's, you know, that there's difficulties in the hierarchy and there's all this stuff. So I think you're right that in some ways when technology, because it has so much reach, when it can point back to physical connection, point back to presence and to relationships, and obviously to going to church, to worshiping, to having a family, then you know, it's doing what it can. It's doing the best thing that it can do, you know. And also, like, by connecting people, because one of the things, this is actually probably one of the biggest thing that technology is doing, is that when things contract the way they're contracting now, let's say, as you know, even though there is this kind of renewal that we see happening with young people in terms of Christianity, it's still shrinking, right? So it's like Christianity is still shrinking because for all the reason why it was shrinking before. And so one of the things the online world does is that it can create an alternative network in order to create a sense of a body. You know, so even though you go to maybe your parish church, your church in your town, and it's all white-headed people except for 3 people, and it's like if it was just that, you would think this is not worth it. Like, what am I doing? You know, but because you can then go online and be connected to all these people that are going through similar things as you are and that are trying to push through, then it can create a kind of momentum. So it's not just about information, but it's actually about connectivity in the way that what the internet does. In the negative sense, it does it too, right? So it's like, you know, there probably might have been people 100 years ago that had something akin to a furry fetish, like, even though it didn't exist because it was so weird and so rare, but because now they're able to go on Reddit or Tumblr or wherever these people go and create networks, then it creates a body for something that before didn't really have a clear body, you know. And so in some ways, I think traditional thinking and you know, kind of traditional values can also ride that, you know, can also use that same process, but then to create bodies that point back to the world and point back to reality.
Yeah, so I think that's like one concrete example in which we can build a kind of arc with technology, do something good. And I think we need, like, no one needed to build the ark, or like Adam and Eve had the garments of skin. Like we live in a world where like this technology is here, and I don't think we can just ignore it. Like one way to have high fertility rates is to be poor. Like poor nations have higher fertility rates, but like in a world where other nations industrialize, like you can stay that, like you're not gonna thrive that way. So you need to use technology in good ways to perpetuate yourself, like in the future. So I think it's this balance that we'll need to maintain in the future.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the point you make about the arc, and to always remember that, especially as technology becomes pervasive and kind of, it seems like it's taking over everything, to remember that God's salvation for the fallen world before the flood was a technological one. So it wasn't only that, it was also to find the just person, right, and to gather his seed and to kind of gather creation in that moment. But it was done in some part through the means of technology. I think it's important to remember.
Yeah.
All right. Well, who says we don't talk about controversial things here on Symbolic? So check out the Post-Reductionist book. It's really great, and like I said, it's a quick read. It's very efficient. Like, if you need to kind of bring together the arguments that you've heard all through the Symbolic World, but also, a lot of modern thinkers like David Bentley Hart, and John Vervaeke, and all these people that are thinking about what's going on. It's definitely the book to check out. And so, Jean-Philippe, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Jonathan.
And don't forget, check out the article as well. We'll put the link in the description. What was the name of the article, if you remember?
It's Is This the Flood? Is Babel Next?
All right. Thanks, everyone.